Now, Equal Education says overcrowding in schools can be tackled if government meets them halfway to resolve this issue. The organisation has released a report on overcrowding in Gauteng schools. Its research has found that some schools in eGauteng have 15% more pupils in a classroom. eNCA reporter Pule Letshwiti-Jones brings us the latest. Pule, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Can you just take us through this all-important report?
So this report basically details how overcrowding has an impact on lessons when pupils are attending school, and of course learners as well, but particularly around what's the concern is around the threshold that's been not being adhered to by some of the schools, especially in eTwatwa and Overcrowding. So the research conducted focuses on about 9 schools, and then around one of the schools from the 9 actually bridged a threshold of having more than 50% of students within a class. So they say that this has an impact on the attention span of learners as well. But particularly what they're concerned about is the under-resourced schools, whereby staffers now have to not only teach but provide photocopies and go out and attend to principal meetings and come back in schools, and they believe that this has a negative impact on staffers in terms of fatigue and of course their span when in class. But if you listen to this by one of the head of research as well, you have a glimpse and understanding of what she meant when she said overcrowding has a negative impact on classes.
Government over the last decade or so have been missing deadlines in terms of providing adequate school infrastructure to ensure that schools are safe and that they are conducive to teaching and learning. One of the provisions in the norms is the provision of adequate or sufficient number of classrooms, and this particular deliverable was meant to have been met in November 2020, but we know that we're still dealing with that, and the report also uncovers that. And as you mentioned, we visited 9 schools in eTwatwa. We found that the data that we had found was quite contradictory to what government, the GDE, is actually putting out there. But we found also that overcrowding is very multi-layered. So it's not just about too many learners and a few teachers. It's about the number of learners in the school. It's about the subjects taught in the school. It's about the teachers. It's about the support staff. It's about the access to furniture. And the way that the GDE looks at overcrowding is looking at it from a whole school perspective. So you get the average of the school, one teacher is to 40 learners, but when you deep dive into the school, you might find that sure, geography is 1 to 25, for example, but then history is 1 to 65. So we are asking that the GDE looks at the issue more comprehensively, more holistically.
Very interesting what she's saying, Pule. I must say, some of us were very narrow in our understanding of the implications around having a large number of students in a classroom. We're really talking about teachers' inability to give all those children attention. But how can this issue be resolved?
Personally, I went to school where there was about 40 of us in the classroom, right? But what we understand is that she's saying that this has been persisting for far too long, and that the analysis that has been provided by the Gauteng Department of Education and the stats and the research isn't cooperating with what they found when they went into the ground and started conducting their own research. Now, you remember that with private schools, they're much more strict about the number of pupils and learners who attend their classes. And they're basically saying, look, equal education for all. Come down on the ground and see how learners are actually having to be attended to, especially by teachers. Now, we're speaking of a new COVID-19 variant that's been, of course, identified by scientists as well. And they're saying this matter could actually now be serious as well if now learners are going into overcrowded classes, and there's this variant that has been discovered by scientists as well. And if you listen to one of the former researchers from the Department of Education, when she speaks about this matter, you'd have an idea of how she's saying that some of the research that was conducted by the Gauteng Department of Education does not corroborate with what they found as well.
The Gauteng Department of Education, for example, is very aware that there's a massive classroom shortage. So over 2,000, and it's been like that way for years and years. And so they are placing prefabricated classrooms in existing schools. But the issue we have with that is that it's a stopgap solution. It doesn't take into account sanitation facilities, labs, halls, all those things, and all those things are getting overused. And then to make it worse, it's not forward-looking. So we know that in Gauteng, every year there's about a 2.5% increase in our learner population because there's a lot of in-migration. And so we can't in February of every year say there's 10,000, 20,000 learners who don't have a place. We have to plan. We know the population is going to increase every year, and we have to plan for that. So the prefab classrooms can be an immediate solution, but they're not long term. We need to understand the context, and in certain areas, in township schools, in certain areas, the population is going to increase year on end, and we have to plan for that.
It seems the situation is very dire. I'm not getting much on how it can be resolved because, yes, she's stating that the Gauteng department is in fact aware. They've decided to go the prefab situation where you have those, which is a temporary situation. But now, what happens when there's no land? We've seen the mushrooming of these private schools, some of them not necessarily registered. Right. Would you say we could attribute it to this, where they saw the gap, that there's overcrowding in these public schools, and then now a lot of individuals are starting up these type of private schools?
I think also as well, practical intervention is very important here, and when we speak to them as well, they give a sense of a message that government has turned a blind eye to the situation for far too long, and what has to happen now is, like you said, while there's a shortage of land, there has to be an alternative in terms of building mobile classes for now to try and catch up and ensure that other schools, other public schools can be built to accommodate some of these students who are coming from disadvantaged communities as well. Because you'd remember during a time of COVID-19 as well in the beginning, they had to now reshuffle pupils and take them to different schools around different regions, and that also is costly for example, a family member who cannot afford transport money for their kids to go to some of these schools. So they are saying that it's high time the government comes to the ground and listens to some of their recommendations on the report, which includes practical intervention and, of course, most importantly, feasible implementations that can meet them halfway.
No, Pule, thank you very much for that. That's reporter Pule Letshwiti-Jones just speaking to us on Equal Education's most recent report.